If your psoas feels tight after a back injury, your first instinct is often to stretch it. But that can be the wrong move. First, you need to ask why it's tightened up. Your tight hip flexors usually aren't the cause of your pain. They're a temporary safety mechanism your nervous system has turned on to stabilise a vulnerable part of your spine. So before you remove the protection, you need to get proper protection from elsewhere. In this video, I'll show you the order that actually makes sense, so you can break the cycle of pain and tightness and prevent future flare-ups. You're going to learn when stretching your psoas is a bad idea and why it may refuse to release anyway. The spine first basics that calm things down and give your spine the protection it needs, bracing, hinging and core endurance. And when and how to mobilise your hips and rebuild your glutes. Let me start with a real example. Christian had chronic low back pain for almost a year. He had a disc bulge in his lumbar spine and a surgeon told him surgery would probably be inevitable at some point. When I assessed him, he couldn't even do a simple glute bridge without provoking his pain. And here's why. His hip flexors were so tight that he couldn't extend his hips properly. So every time he tried to get his hips into extension, his hips got blocked, his glutes couldn't fire, and he compensated by moving through his back instead, arching through his lumbar spine. And that was a pain trigger for him. The frustrating part for him was that he had already been given hip flexor stretches by his physio, but they hadn't helped. He wasn't looking for another quick fix, he wanted a long-term solution, not just for his hips, but for his back pain. Your psoas is one of the main connectors of your trunk to your legs, attaching from every level of your lumbar spine and T12 to your femur. It's one of the main hip flexors and it can also behave like a spine stabiliser. So after a low back injury, for example a disc bulge or a herniation, where the affected joint loses some of its stiffness, your nervous system can tell the psoas to stiffen up and protect the area. That tightness can be a smart short-term strategy because it adds stiffness to a vulnerable joint. But if you stretch it aggressively while your spine still feels unsafe, two things tend to happen. One, it doesn't stretch because your brain doesn't want to remove the protective stiffness. Or two, it does stretch and your back flares up because you remove the stabilising strategy too soon. So instead of treating the symptoms, in this case tight hips, it makes a lot more sense to identify the root cause of your pain. This is done via an in-depth interview and biomechanical movement assessment that involves the deliberate provocation of your pain triggers. If your assessment reveals, for example, that you're intolerant of flexion, extension, then you first need to avoid these movements to allow your pain to desensitise and your back to heal. This will tell your brain that it can reduce the protective stiffness or tightness of your hip flexors. So, instead of treating the tightness like the root cause, understand that it's a symptom and try to identify the movements that provoke your pain. Are you intolerant of flexion, extension, compression? Which postures, movements or loads tend to trigger your pain? Once you've identified your pain triggers, the priority should be to avoid provoking them. This will allow your pain to desensitise and your back to begin healing. So number one, protect the spine first. Brace, hinge and build core endurance. Before removing protective stiffness that your tight psoas is providing, you need to give your spine the protection it needs from elsewhere. The first thing is the abdominal brace. So when you brace your abs correctly, you stabilise your spine and eliminate any micro movements that can trigger your pain or make your back pain worse. One of the biggest mistakes I see when people try to brace their abs is sucking their stomach in. This is a misguided attempt to target a muscle called the transverse abdominis and actually limits the amount of stiffness you can give to your spine. As you can see in this image, the muscles that cover the largest area of the circumference of your trunk are the internal obliques, the external obliques, and the transverse abdominis, which are all layered on top of one another. The fibres of these muscles run in different directions, in a similar way to how the fibres in the different layers of plywood run perpendicular to one another. This is what gives plywood its extra strength. and it's what gives your abdominal wall extra strength if you contract them all at once. 2 fingers each hand, and you're going to stick them into your abdominal wall where your obliques are. So you're going to push them in, and then with your abdominal muscles, you're going to stiffen those muscles, which pushes your fingers out. That action stiffens all the layers of muscles that you have around your torso here. It's a technique you can use to perform any movement where you need to stabilise your spine to avoid triggering your back pain. The key is to tune the stiffness of the brace to the task. So if you're going to pick up a pen off the floor, you might want to stiffen the brace to about 20%, but if you're going to pick up one of your kids, depending on how big they are, you probably want closer to maximum stiffness. For some people, abdominal bracing might add too much compression to the spine, which can provoke your pain. In that case, you can try a pec and lat brace. So pecs and lats, we're going to bring your shoulders down away from your ears like you're doing an anti-shrug, and contracting pecs and lats at the same time. Okay, so this will provide some stability to your spine, some stiffness, without the added compression that you get with the abdominal brace. Number 2, the hip hinge. Moving at the hips, not through the spine. Okay, now to practice this, you can use a broomstick or something similar. And we're going to have 3 points of contact, okay? Coccyx, between your shoulder blades on your spine, and the back of your head. Okay, you can have your knees slightly flexed. Okay, and just from there, we're going to send the hips back. Okay, as far as you can go while maintaining those 3 points of contact. You're going to feel some tension building in the hamstrings. If you go too far and you lose that point of contact with your coccyx, then it's no longer a hip hinge. You've started flexing your lumbar spine. Okay, so you only want to go to the point where you can maintain those 3 points of contact, and that's the same point you would go to when doing a deadlift. You should practice the movement until it starts to feel more natural, becoming aware of what your range of motion is. Then apply it to your day-to-day activities like putting a plate in the dishwasher, picking something up off the floor, or picking up a heavy object. Number 3, core endurance. To maintain good posture. If your trunk muscles fatigue quickly, your posture and movement quality degrade. And your passive tissues like your discs and ligaments take the stress. The McGill Big 3 are a series of exercises that target your front, your back and your lateral core muscles. They were identified by Stuart McGill as the exercises that provide the most amount of stimulus to your core muscles while inflicting the least amount of stress on the passive tissues of your spine. You've got the bird dog, the side plank, and the curl up. There are several progressions and regressions of each exercise. The appropriate version should be chosen and dosed according to your individual capabilities. I'm going to go into more detail regarding this in another video, but for the moment I'll include links in the description below to separate videos I made for each exercise. If your core muscles aren't sufficiently trained, then they can't give your spine the protection it needs. This means that the passive tissues in your spine, so ligaments and discs, will be put under greater stress. And when this stress accumulates, it can result in injury and pain. So if you improve the muscular endurance of the core muscles that stabilise your spine, you'll have a much better chance of being able to maintain pain-free postures throughout the day, which will allow your injured passive tissues to heal. Once you've improved their endurance, your psoas won't need to compensate as much, and you'll be able to mobilise your hips. Now it's time to restore hip motion and rebuild glute capacity. So step 1, mobilise the psoas. You can start with gentle self-release using a yoga ball if it's tolerable. It's actually to help calm down the nervous system that is keeping your muscles tight. Then you can move on to a standing psoas stretch. So why standing? Because the common half kneeling hip flexor stretch often biases more towards the iliacus, another hip flexor. And it can increase stress on your hip capsule if you push it too much. Step 2, rebuild glutes with safe signal exercises. So your glutes are the biggest, strongest muscles in your body. They provide you with the power you need to extend your hips during running, jumping, squatting and lunging. However, to generate their full power output, your brain needs to perceive that it's safe to do so. If it detects instability, then it will turn down the power provided to them by the nervous system. This makes sense if you think about it, because transferring maximum force through an injured spine is unlikely to end well. Reducing the power output to your glutes may be a clever way to protect your spine, but it also results in your glutes becoming weaker. They're likely to atrophy, becoming smaller if your injury is bad enough to put you out of action for more than a couple of weeks. Once you've learned how to move in a way that protects your spine, you've improved your core endurance and mobilised your hips, we can now start building your glute muscles more. I'm going to show you 3 exercises that target your glutes without overloading your spine. So the first are split squats. Great for active hip mobility after doing the standing psoas stretch that I just showed you. Then we've got the glute bridge. And then thirdly, clamshells, which is like an introduction to external rotation. Progress these before you rush back into heavy squats and deadlifts. The key takeaway here is that if your hips feel tight and your glutes feel weak after a back injury, the best order is usually, number 1, stop provoking your pain triggers so your nervous system can calm down. Build spine stability and endurance, that's number 2, which is bracing, hinging and core endurance. Then number 3, restore hip mobility and rebuild glute strength without irritating the spine. So the pattern that people typically train the glutes in is hip extension, as we looked at with the glute bridge and the split squats. And we touched on the other pattern that a lot of people skip in their training, which is external hip rotation, that we started with the clamshells. Now, I made another video that shows how to develop this further. You can watch that here.